The Batman Tragedy and the Culture of Death in America. Hi, I'm Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel. Joining me is Matt Barber, vice president of Liberty Counsel Action. Matt, we want to talk about this tragedy that happened in Colorado, the most shooting tragedy of the entire history of America in terms of someone coming in and killing so many people wantonly like this individual did. And it certainly is a major tragedy that happened, and our hearts and prayers go out to the victims and those who were wounded. And many of those who survived are obviously going to have some issues to deal with from that tragedy that they experienced in Colorado. Yeah. But you actually wrote an article, and it dealt with the Batman movie and the culture of death. You were not very far from the theater when it actually happened. You were in the Aurora, Colorado area on the very moment that this happened.
That's right. My family lives out in the Denver area. We were out visiting. Woke up to the horrible news early in the morning. The morning that it happened, I had another column. I write a weekly column. I had it prepared, and it just, in light of the tragedy, it was just seemed trivial. So I focused on certainly the immediate tragedy at hand, which was this diabolical, insane young man, James Holmes, going in and taking all of these innocent lives. 12 dead, I believe. At least 38 plus people injured. One of the dead was a 6-year-old child. But I wanted to point out the blame certainly for the shooting rests solely on this individual who chose to go in and take all of these innocent lives. However, you can't help but look at this and think, just mere decades ago, something like this would have just shocked everybody to the point that, now we've become desensitized to it. You have Columbine, you have the Virginia Tech shootings where I think actually physically more people actually died during that shooting. This is certainly the most people who've ever died in a theater shooting like this. But these things just keep happening one after another, and you have to ask, what is going on here? Why is our culture, why is this happening, and why have we become so desensitized to it? And I couldn't help but draw the parallels to our kind of the violence that everybody almost worships. Kids worship this violence. And then I ultimately drew the parallel in a culture that throws away innocent unborn children through abortion, homicide. Our youth are being taught that life is meaningless and can be taken just as a matter of convenience, can be snuffed out simply because it's inconvenient to let that life progress.
And the article was very well written, and of course you had people that responded to it in their blogs, and you see, I mean, the point of your article actually was illustrated in some of the people that responded to it in a very negative, vitriolic way, that they are almost completely resisting the fact that there is a moral decay that's taking place in the country, when in fact there really is. You mentioned the word insane, and I agree that he's insane, but not from a legal perspective.
Certainly.
Because this obviously was a situation where he planned it over a significant period of time and intended to take out many lives. Whenever someone does that, we refer to them as insane. But he's not, I don't think, legally insane, although maybe that's a defense he will raise. But I think the main point, though, is a couple of things. One, we have developed a culture of death in several ways. And obviously from the beginning of life, we've developed that since 1973 with Roe versus Wade. We've always said that when you cheapen life on one end of the spectrum, you cheapen it on the other ends of the spectrums as well. From cradle to grave, when you cheapen it at the cradle, you cheapen it all the way through our life, all the way through the grave. And euthanasia at the very end, or the value of life not being worth living at the very end. And from 1973 to the present, we've killed over 50 million babies in very brutal fashion. And we call that choice. And we celebrate that as a woman's right, and that is a pinnacle of choice. And we have litmus tests that, for example, President Obama uses to have people that are pro-abortion in his administration, saying that he wants to ultimately, first very active president when he ran for president was to sign into law a Freedom of Choice Act. So we've got this rampant through our system. We've got it rampant through the administration. We have it rampant through our history, and it's gone through different administrations where we haven't overturned this in the courts or in the legislature. We also have the moral breakdown that we've seen with the eviction of God and morality from our schools and from our culture. And there are consequences that ultimately flow from that. You see in the movies, the more violent nature of movies. And in fact, you see here in this Batman trilogy, Batman has not historically been a violent movie. It's been a movie that, in a comic book that kids could watch. And, you have crime and crime solving, but it wasn't violent crime until this trilogy came out. And the trilogy, interestingly, it seems like it started because of a comic book that came out, I think, in 1986, where there was a shooting in a theater and Batman was blamed for this particular shooting, and this person began to decide to put a more darker edge on Batman. And so this particular Batman was a violent movie.
Yeah.
And we're taking kids there. We're taking, unfortunately, we see that a 6-year-old young, beautiful girl died in this tragedy. And you have to ask yourself, people are feeding themselves, they are growing up in a culture of death. They're feeding themselves death images in movies such as Batman and others. And then we're shocked that this happens, and we ought to be shocked that it happens. But there is a cause and effect.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't just continue to simply kill unborn children, have a culture of death where you kick morals and God out of our culture, feed yourselves on violent video games and on movies, and then assume that this is a surprise.
That some of that doesn't stick, and that's exactly right. And I've been mischaracterized in my article of saying that abortion caused these murders. Well, yes and no. I'm not saying it directly caused it, but I'm saying that certainly abortion, just like these murders, just like the violence that we see rampant in television, they are symptoms of this culture of death. And I point out in my article, just as you mentioned, Matt, that ultimately I think the primary cause of this is the reality that we as a nation have lost our way. We have turned our back on the principles embraced by our founding fathers, the Judeo-Christian, unequivocally. The historical record is very clear. They try to debate it. The revisionists, the liberal revisionists, try to say that this isn't so, but we know the documentary evidence is overwhelming that we were a Christian nation, in that the vast majority of our founders were Christian men, at the very least were deists.
And they operated at least through a Christian worldview perspective. And it's just like an athlete. If you're training, you're exercising right and you're eating right, so your calories burned are exceeding the calorie intake. And why would somebody be surprised if all of a sudden they're gaining weight because they're eating all kinds of sugars and carbohydrates and they're not exercising? Whatever you put into your system, you're ultimately going to see the results of, whether it's physically in terms of how you eat or what you put in your mind. And when you put this garbage into your mind, you develop a culture of death. When you have death around you every day, and what you see and what you hear and what you play on these video games ultimately has violence and death where life is meaningless, then you will have, unfortunately, Colorado. You will have Columbine. You will have Virginia Tech. Those will be natural consequences of the breakdown and decay of society.
It is a cause and effect, and one of the big ones, again, is abortion. This is the sacred cow of the left. Abortion, they worship at the altar of euphemistic so-called choice, and our children are taught, they buy into this nonsense that life is meaningless, that the unborn child in the womb until somehow, seconds later, the child is born, that life is meaningless. We have to expect these types of consequences.
Well, get involved in not only praying for this country, but also doing something for this country as well. And in fact, we have a sticker. It is a bumper sticker called Pray and Vote. And the bumper sticker is actually one that you can put on your car. It's just called Pray and Vote. We need to pray in this country for forgiveness and for healing. 2 Chronicles 7:14 speaks about that, and you're familiar with that passage. We obviously need to seriously pray that our country has revival, renewal, and healing. But we also need to vote. We need to do something both in our community as well as at the ballot box. More information, go to Liberty Counsel's website, lc.org. And remember to pray and also financially support the ministry of Liberty Counsel.